Welcome back to Norcroms History. In today's video, we'll be doing a full deep dive on the Norwegian model of 1894 Krag Jørgensen bayonet. We'll be talking about the development of how it came to be. We'll also be going through the production of the bayonet itself, so inspection marks, the different inspectors, as well as the production numbers and the different manufacturers of this bayonet as well. So if you have your own 1894 bayonet, you actually might learn something new about it today. Also, just to note, the German model of 1894 is not in this video, as it deserves to be with all the other German bayonets that I'll be doing a separate video on as well. So yeah, let's begin. The model of 1894 bayonet started its life in 1892, when the Norwegian Rifle Commission of 1891, that was currently testing the Krag Jørgensen, wanted to see its accuracy with a bayonet on. So they decided to produce a couple, and they originally took a model of 1889 Danish Krag Jørgensen bayonet as a standpoint. However, already by autumn of 1892, the bayonet was already modified in such a way that was very close to what we have here. As you can see, it was very close to this model of a bayonet right here. In fact, I have a picture of one of these rare early trial bayonets right here. And we know of two of these to exist. We have one that is just marked number 2, and we don't have any other markings, as well as one we know that Erik Jørgensen himself worked with the Solingen factory in Germany to produce. And this also kept the regular rear locking mechanism of the 1889 bayonet. Folding bayonets and other unconventional models were tested. However, we do not have any pictures or any documentation of what this would have been. We know about folding bayonets, but nothing else. However, in 1893, the Rifle Commission recommended a simple knife bayonet anyways. And at this point, the development of this bayonet have come so far that it is basically identical to what we have here today. Basically, this is how it looked like at that point. This was perfect timing, as the Krag was just entering the field trial phase with 50 examples being sent out to troops. So they decided with some of these rifles, bayonets would come with. So this was then of course tested, and the bayonets were found to be more than good enough for adoption. The Krag Jørgensen rifle was officially adopted by royal decree on the 21st of April 1894. However, an interesting thing to note is that the bayonet was in fact never mentioned in this adoption at all. However, it's safe to assume with the production numbers and everything like that the bayonet was of course then as well adopted at the same time. An interesting thing is that the bayonet is actually officially first mentioned in the adoption of the 1912 carbine, where they had mentioned of course the bayonet, the short bayonet, as well as the scabbard and frog, and that will be the sword style frog as we can see right here. Now let's take a closer look at these bayonets and go over the production history, identification, and also of course the different inspectors marks. Here I have two examples of bayonet that we'll be taking a look at. I have a Kongsberg produced one and a Steyr one that I'll just be using as a reference point for how they look. As you can see here, the way you of course remove this from the scabbard is just by this simple button right here. You just push this in and you can of course remove this from the scabbard like so. And here you have the bayonet just quite simply as well. Just to note, the way that this blade is actually made is quite interesting, and I'll actually be taking a look at that right now here. I'll show you a really interesting bayonet I have here. I have decided to remove the grips off of this bayonet right here to show you how the mechanism actually works when it comes to the fastening to the rifle. And as you can see here, it's actually not a lot going on in here. You have, of course, the locking piece at the back here, and when I push this button, as you can see, it just drops that. And I'll be showing you how this mounts onto the Krag rifle as well in a moment. As well, when I, of course, push this button, you can see that all it does is just pivots that point on this point right here. And you can see that it is actually spring-loaded here. Very interesting. This bayonet, of course, we'll be talking about in a moment, because this is not any of those two bayonets there. The bayonet measures at 33.5 centimeters in total length, with a blade length of roughly 21.5 centimeters and a width of 1.9 centimeters at the guard over here. The construction of this bayonet is actually really interesting, as it was in fact stamped steel in different phases. I actually have a picture of it right here showing the different production phases of this bayonet from start to finish. It was polished or belt sanded. The grips were wooden slabs secured with a single screw. I have a couple of them right here. You can see that they're just manually carved on the inside, and there are two inletted metal pieces here that the screw, which is this right here, can go into, and you can just see it inlays perfectly with the wood right there. And of course that goes on the other side and screws into the other inlay on the other side. Also to note, the blade has no fuller, as you can see here, giving it a really clean and spear point profile. The scabbards measured around 22.7 centimeters, although variations can occur. The early ones were lacquered black, like this one right here. Of course, it has a little bit of wear and tear as it's over 100 years old. Over time, most were, of course, blued. And by the 1920s and 30s, many were re-lacquered using standard black paint, thinned out to avoid a massive amount of buildup on the scabbard itself. Functionally, these bayonets weren't sharpened by the factory, but during the 1905 mobilization, many units hastily sharpened them in preparation for a possible conflict with Sweden. This was later deemed a poor decision, described by the army itself as more harm than good. As a result, the factory considered supplying pre-sharpened blades, but instead opted to issue sharpening instructions for field use. And in fact, this bayonet here has not been sharpened, and it still has that main dull blade. If you look at another blade I have right here, this one has in fact been sharpened, as you can see here. It has a decent sharp edge on it as here. Now let's take a look and see how this bayonet actually mounts to the rifle itself. And here you can see the rail for the bayonet, and you can see it's just a simple rail system. It's not really anything advanced, and that'll match up with the slot right here. All you have to do is push down this button that lowers the latch, hold it in, get it onto the rail, hold it in still, slide, release, and this way it actually won't fall off at all. It's actually quite hard to remove this at this point. The only way is to either break the bayonet or break the rifle. If not, just hold in the bayonet button right here and release it like so. While the M1894 bayonet might seem like a straightforward piece of kit, its production history is actually something completely different. When the Krag Jørgensen rifle was adopted in 1894, the plan was to produce both rifles and bayonets at Kongsberg Våpenfabrik, but the factory quickly ran into capacity problems. Rifle production took absolute priority, understandably, since a bayonet is useless without a rifle to mount on it. As a result, bayonets were only produced in small numbers during the first couple of years. To bridge the gap, the Norwegian state placed emergency contracts with Husqvarna in Sweden and Steyr in Austria. Husqvarna delivered just 2,000 bayonets at the end of 1894. These were made to the exact specification of the Norwegian model and is identical, of course, to the ones we have here. And they were sent unnumbered to Kongsberg, where they were matched and numbered to the rifles on arrival. The Steyr contract was much larger, with 29,000 bayonets to accompany the rifles that they were building for the army. This production ran into delays, and by 1897, the Norwegian authorities pressured Steyr into providing 4,000 additional bayonets free of charge as compensation. These extras were later issued alongside Kongsberg-made rifles to fill in the gaps in supply. Meanwhile, Kongsberg itself didn't really get proper bayonet production going until 1897 or 1898, once rifle orders had stabilized and capacity freed up. From then on, Kongsberg began delivering bayonets in large quantities, producing over 101,000 units in total. Because every bayonet was supposed to be numbered to match its rifle, this early production chaos led to some messy serial number gaps. For example, Husqvarna and Steyr bayonets ended up with the rifle serials in the 20,000 to 39,000 range, while Kongsberg bayonets sometimes appeared sprinkled in some of those blocks or even lower, especially when replacements were being made or for earlier rifles. On short, what seems to be a clean system on paper, one rifle, one bayonet, quickly became a logistical juggling act, especially in those first critical years. When examining the Norwegian M1894 bayonet, one of the most fascinating and overlooked details are actually the inspector's marks. Stamped into the ricasso or the scabbard, these small initials or symbols really connect the bayonet to a specific person, a control officer, assistant, or in some cases, a factory gunsmith. Let's go through the key inspectors associated with the M1894 bayonet, and in particular, which versions they were involved with. Kaptein Påske was a fundamental figure behind early Norwegian weapons inspection. He was born in 1863, he became a control officer at Kongsberg in 1893, and quickly rose to factory director in 1896. He personally oversaw the earliest Krag rifles and bayonets, and was often away on factory business, including overseeing the Norwegian contracts abroad. Most notably, he headed up the Norske Geværkontroll Steyr, where he inspected thousands of Austrian-made rifles and bayonets. Here are Kaptein Påske's inspector's marks. His marking was mostly seen on early Kongsberg-produced bayonets, Husqvarna bayonets that were inspected after the arrival at Kongsberg, and especially Steyr-made bayonets, produced between 1895 and 1897. Even after becoming director, his stamp was applied to batches inspected under his supervision. His direct involvement waned over time, but his legacy remained visible through Kongsberg's output. Captain Ole Adolf Julsrud joined the factory in 1895 and quickly became the backbone of domestic inspection. From 1895 to 1899, he was responsible for inspecting and stamping most of the bayonets and rifles produced at Kongsberg. He also served as acting director when Påske was stationed in Steyr. His marking is typically found on the early to mid Kongsberg 1894 bayonets, especially between 1895 and 1899. And rare examples of late Husqvarna bayonets that were numbered and inspected at Kongsberg. Julsrud later became a colonel and Norway's Felttøymester, its top military ordnance officer. Kranner's time at Kongsberg from 1899 to 1911 coincides with some of the heaviest production years of the 1894 bayonet. He was widely respected by workers and fellow officers for his work ethic and fairness. His BC stamp appears on Kongsberg 1894 bayonets from 1899 up to about serial number 76,000, when the H7 monogram began appearing. His marking also appeared on some early 1912 bayonets as production was being transitioned. Kranner left Kongsberg after a personal conflict with Påske, the infamous Kranner-saken, but he was later cleared and went out to work in education. Kaptein Håkon Finne took over as control officer in 1912, following Kranner's departure. He stayed in that role through Kongsberg's production peak during World War I, when demand for rifles, carbines, and bayonets surged. Finne's stamp appears on late-made Kongsberg 1894 bayonets, especially from 1912 to 1922. Some 1912 and 1916 bayonets also had his marking. He later returned to Kongsberg as factory director from 1926 to 1940, guiding the plant through another era of change. Captain Halvdan Alstad served alongside Finne and had full stamping rights from 1914 and onward. He later ran the mitrailleuse, or the machine gun, and pistol departments. While not as prolific as Finne, his stamp appears on a small number of 1894 bayonets from around 1914 to 1917, and his post-war reworks and later replacement bayonets. He also worked on the post-war reworks and late replacement bayonets in the late 1940s, particularly between 1945 and 1949. He's one of the few inspectors whose work spans from both pre- and post-World War II periods. Premierløytnant Ingvald Åsmund Bach had one of the shortest inspection periods, serving briefly from 1901 to 1903. Because of this, his stamp is very rare to see today, and if you find one, it is quite valuable. He likely inspected a limited number of Kongsberg-made 1894 bayonets around the turn of the century. His career later was in the field artillery. Knut Kvål is perhaps best known to collectors for late period and replacement bayonets. He worked at Kongsberg from 1923 to 1936 during the tail end of the military bayonet production and reissuance. His KK stamp is commonly found on replacement M1894 bayonets, also known as Erstatningsbajonetter, and occasionally on reissued or arsenal refurbished bayonets. Some rare M1916 bayonets also has his marking. His presence tells us a bayonet was likely inspected or issued well after the original production run. Underrustmester Severin Simensen wasn't a commissioned officer, but a factory gunsmith with inspection authority. He joined in 1897 and became a Underrustmester in 1900. His SS mark appears on Kongsberg-produced 1894 bayonets post-1912. Also possibly some replacement bayonets during periods when control officers were absent. He rarely took full responsibility for rifles, but had primarily oversight of bayonet inspections at times. With over 100,000 1894 bayonets produced across 3 factories and multiple contract batches, identification can be a bit difficult at times. But once you know what to look for, each bayonet really reveals its own origin, whether it came from Kongsberg, Husqvarna, or Steyr. Let's break it down factory by factory using a combination of serial numbers, markings, and finer production details. Just to note, I do not actually own a Husqvarna bayonet to use for this video, so I'll be using pictures as a replacement. Now let's start with the Kongsberg bayonet. Now one thing in general that's really interesting to note is when you're looking at a bayonet, you'll see on these Krag bayonets, you'll see sometimes a H7 marking right here, which I'll show you up here as well, zoomed in. and that'll be on the right side. Now, if it's a pre-1905 bayonet, this will not have this crown marking. This marking actually indicates when Norway got their king, as in the King Haakon VII. So normally, if it's after 1905, you'll find this marking on it, and it'll take the place of where normally the factory marking would be. And the factory marking was flipped over onto the other side right here. And I'll show you a zoomed in picture, of course, right over here. So if you see a crowned K on your bayonet, you'll know that this is produced in Kongsberg. And if you see the crowned H7 on this, it also shows that this is a post-1905 bayonet. I can show you an example right here, if you give me a moment. This bayonet, which we'll be getting onto later, is an example of a pre-1905 bayonet. As you can see, it has the factory marking on the right side and nothing on the left side of the blade whatsoever. It's completely blank. So back to the Kongsberg bayonet, you'll see, of course, the Kongsberg crowned K, as well as the inspector stamp below on the right side here. Now, it's kind of hard to see, but I'll be showing you some close-up pictures on the right of the video here. This inspector's mark here has Haakon Finnes marking. You'll also see the serial number on the right side here as well. This one is relatively low serial number. And of course, there's nothing on the other side here. You of course also will see on the bottom here, two different inspector's markings here. This one here, of course, is a individual factory worker and not actually the main inspector's mark. So this is probably a filer's mark or, of course, a earlier inspector's mark. And this one here is marked B, which we don't actually have a full-on overview of what these different markings actually mean. But this one is then marked by someone that had the name or last name of B. Taking a look at the other Krag bayonet here, you can see this one is in a little bit worse condition as I've restored it, but it still has a lot of information to give us. This one here, as you can see, has nothing on the left side, meaning it's a pre-1905 bayonet. And you can also see it has the crowned K right here, and it also has a Bjarne Kranne's inspector's mark right here. Now, this serial number is actually right before the H7 marking was added, as this is in the 73,000th range. And we know that the H7 marking came at around 76,000. So this is probably one of the last batches of bayonets not to have that marking. And of course, this one is in relatively rough shape, but I have restored it from a really rusty condition as well. Also, you'll see markings on the scabbard, of course. You have the full serial number right here on the bayonet, as well as the three last letters of the serial number either on the top here or on the bottom here. Really depends, really. It's not standardized. It's just either there or below there. Here you can also see a locking piece, which we'll be getting later to when we're talking about the frog, which will be at the end of the video. You'll also find markings on the end of the scabbard as well. However, this one here is relatively worn, but I do have a picture of one right here, as you can see. For serial number ranges on the Kongsberg, we know that regular production began at about 40,000. Production ran well into 100,000, making Kongsberg bayonets the overall most common bayonet. Of course, there are some scattered numbers that appeared earlier, between 20,201 and 40,000. This was to fill gaps in the serial number ranges using leftover stock or replacement batches. Another thing is, all of these bayonets, of course, are polished or, of course, left in the white. The scabbards were originally blued and lacquered, but later was browned and re-lacquered with standard black paint. Now let's go over to the Husqvarna bayonets. The Husqvarna contract was a stopgap contract solution during Kongsberg early production bottleneck. The main way to identify a Husqvarna bayonet, of course, is the factory marking, which is a crowned H. However, it is relatively distinct, but is very often mistaken for Kongsberg crowned K, and I'll be showing you a picture of the two right here, and you can see quite easily why they were, of course, confused. You really have to squint or zoom in to see really what marking it is. Above this, you'll often see a very early Påske inspector's mark, usually at its usual position. Husqvarna did not apply serial numbers at the factory. Instead, Kongsberg added serial numbers to match specific rifles after the bayonets arrived in Norway. These numbers were stamped at the crossguard, scabbard throat, and of course scabbard rear, just like the Kongsberg process that I showed you earlier. Internally, parts may show stenciled or lightly stamped numbers used for factory assembly and not official serialization. For serial number range for the Husqvarna bayonets, they are typically found between 20,201 and 22,950. Some known outliers include bayonets with serial numbers as low as 101 and 116, used for test or private rifles. All in all, only 2,000 Husqvarna bayonets were made. Scabbards were usually blued, then black lacquered, with inspector's mark on the tip as I showed you earlier. Usually, of course, Polska's inspector's mark. The style and finish closely matches Kongsberg, making the markings the most reliable method of identification. And looking at pictures, one of the best ways is looking at the serial number, and sometimes it's not really that easy to see that crowned H compared to the crowned K on pictures. Here are some of my Steyr contract bayonets. Now the Steyr contract was the biggest foreign contributor to the M1894 bayonet program. The bayonet is actually quite easily identifiable with its OE over WG stamp on the right side of the blade, just like the other Kongsberg and Husqvarna locations. Here you can see the factory marking for the Steyr bayonet, and of course this stands for the full name of the Steyr factory, which I'm not going to butcher, but I'll be putting up right here. This one here is of course a very low serial number at 770, and has been, the previous owner has of course very much really liked grease, and I'm going to keep it that way because I think that's how it's been kept in such good condition. I'll be showing you with this bayonet instead because this one is in a better condition when it comes to markings. Here you can see the inspector's mark for the Steyr bayonet, and usually you'll see this MP or PP marking, which is Polska's inspector's mark. Of course as well, serial number like usual here, as well as on the bottom side you have another inspector's mark right here. Also you can see that there's no marking on the left side of the bayonet, and that makes sense because all the Steyr contracts was before 1905 when the King's monogram was added. Like Kongsberg, Steyr numbered the bayonets to match the rifles before export. Extra batches delivered later were numbered in Norway at Kongsberg or at the main arsenal in Oslo. When it comes to the serial number ranges of these bayonets, you have two main batches. You have serial number 1 to 20,000 and 30,001 to 39,000. Additional bayonets were numbered post-factory to fill gaps or issue as spares, and these can appear between 23,000 and 39,700. And you can see on this later issue that the numbers is not perfectly stamped on the bayonet itself, as it was matched to the rifle when it arrived in Norway. And also another interesting part is this bayonet also, in fact, is out of contract. As you can see here, 25,000. So this one is also not within the two main batches of bayonets, and is probably one of the 4,000 that were delivered after the fact. And of course you have this one right here in my collection that is serial number 770, which will be of course within the first batch. In fact, this is the first year of production. Steyr scabbards were usually black lacquered, as you can see on this one right here, but later ones were sandblasted, blued, then relacquered. These bayonets are near identical in form to Kongsberg bayonets, but carry usually cleaner and more machine-applied markings and slightly different font styles. Here we have my Steyr bayonet and of course the Kongsberg bayonet, and you can see the difference between fonts here. You can see that the Steyr one is a little bit more pronounced, whilst this one is more, of course, artistic when it comes to just more curvier font. And of course, that just shows the minimal differences between the Steyr bayonet and the Kongsberg bayonet. They are actually very, very identical. Here's a quick identification summary. The Kongsberg bayonets had a crowned K and had a serial number range at around 40,000 to 100,000 and are the most common bayonets. Then you have the Husqvarna bayonets with a crowned H and had a serial number range from 20,201 to 22,950, and only 2,000 of these were made. Then you have the Steyr bayonets that has the OEWG factory marking and had a serial number range from 1 to 20,000 and 30,001 to 39,000 and up. And of course you have those 4 extra that were reissued later that can be outside of this serial number range. And these were very often reissued. So if you're holding an 1894 bayonet and you want to know where it came from, there's 3 things to check. You have the factory marking, the inspector's mark, and of course the serial number. Together, it can tell you its exact origin and where it fits into this fascinating production history. Now we're moving into my favorite category of 1894 bayonet, the Erstatningsbajonets or the replacement bayonets. Not all M1894 bayonets were delivered alongside the rifle, nor were they all part of the original production batches from Kongsberg, Husqvarna or Steyr. Some bayonets fall into a lesser known category of Erstatningsbajonet or replacement bayonets. As you can expect, in day-to-day military life, bayonets were sometimes lost, damaged or destroyed, especially during training and field maneuvers. To ensure readiness, each unit's armorer or bushmaker kept a supply of spare bayonets on hand. These weren't just leftover stock, They were officially produced and delivered to the army to serve as replacements for missing or unserviceable equipment. Unlike standard bayonets, these were often issued on an as-needed basis and not factory matched to each specific rifle. The easiest way to identify a Erstatningsbajonet is that it has no serial number. Many replacement bayonets were left completely unnumbered, either because they weren't tied to a rifle or because the number was to be added later by the unit armorer. Some armorers did stamp serials in the crossguard or scabbard to match a soldier's rifle, but this was unofficial and usually done using different fonts or uneven stamping. Aside from this, replacement bayonets were nearly identical in construction and finish to a standard model of 1894. They were produced at the same dimensions and quality, just without the specific rifle pairing. Replacement bayonets were issued throughout the lifespan of the Krag system, but was especially important during the interwar years, when equipment was aging, budgets were tight, and reissuing existing gear was more cost-effective than building new. Some were produced or refurbished as late as the 1930s, and there's strong evidence that these bayonets continued to circulate up until 1940. This is confirmed by the presence of inspection stamps from Knut, whose known control period lasted from 1927 to 1936. Kvål's KK stamp appears on several unnumbered or mismatched AM1894 bayonets, strongly indicating his role in final inspection before issue. And we know that many of these replacement bayonets have KK's marking, and in fact that's the most common marking you'll find on these bayonets. Of course there are others, as I'll be showing you later with this one here, which is actually quite special. Today, these bayonets can be confusing to collectors. Some mistake them for worn or mismatched examples, but a clean, unnumbered bayonet, especially one with a post-World War I inspection mark, is often a legitimate Erstatningsbajonet. They serve as a reminder that military logistics wasn't always clean and orderly. The blades were tools, kept in circulation, repurposed, and reissued to meet needs of a small but active army. So if your M1894 bayonet has no number, or it looks like it was hand-stamped by someone in a hurry, it just might be a genuine piece of Norwegian military history, and an often overlooked replacement bayonet. Here's what I believe to be an extremely early replacement bayonet that I have in my collection here. This one stands out immediately from the other bayonets as it's unnumbered, as we know with the Erstatningsbajonets, but here there's something really interesting. On this one, as I showed you earlier, it has no king's monogram at all. You can see it has the Kongsberg marking at the top here, but at the bottom, it was inspected by Ole Adolf Julsrud, the same officer who oversaw thousands of bayonets in the late 1890s. Even more intriguing is what's found on the inside. On the inner surface of the grip, it's marked 22, as I'll be showing you a picture on the inside of this. On the metal frame itself, it's stamped 22, and on one of the grips, it is actually written with pencil 22. This is likely an internal assembly or production number used at the factory. To me, this example represents one of the earliest known replacement bayonets, probably made when Kongsberg was still working to catch up on rifle deliveries and needed spares to fill in the gaps. Every Norwegian Krag bayonet was issued with a sverdtaske or frog. This simple leather carrier allowed the bayonet to be worn securely on the soldier's belt, often on the left side, and played a vital role in the field. Here we have my Steyr bayonet with frog that I'll be using as an example for this section. And to remove it from the scabbard itself, you have this button right here. As you can see here, it's just a spring-loaded button that you just press down. You press it down, and then you just pull out the scabbard. Now this can really depend on bayonet to bayonet, as a lot of them can be stiffer. It just really depends. But here you can see that it basically just locks on this latch right here. Some scabbards have this latch a little bit less pronounced, and it'll be actually easier to remove from the frog itself. Then here we have the frog up close. Now we'll be going over all the different variants of this, and there are actually quite a few, but we'll take a look first at how it just works in general. You have this metal piece right here that is riveted through the leather with 3 rivets on each side, and it goes on the other side here, as you can see. And it's of course 2 layers of leather that's just stitched in this sort of pattern right here. And you can see actually, now that I have removed it, you can see the spring is just a very simple piece that just goes up to the scabbard and just keeps it locked in like so. Many frogs actually have markings on them. Now this one here has something over here that we really can't make out, but on the other side here you have a very pronounced marking right here. And this I believe is Trøndelag Jegerbataljon, TRJB. This actually belongs to a set that I have that is a full soldier's kit, as in belt and pouches that have all the same marking. And as you can see here, it's in pretty good shape for its age. This is a pre-1900s bayonet, so for it to have survived so long is quite impressive in my opinion. And to just put it back in, all we have to do is just line this up correctly, push it through, and if you don't want to damage the finish, hold down the button, push, and then release, and it won't be removed. Now there are actually different versions of the frog here. We have the one that I just showed you here, which is the standard detachable frog that was issued on the earliest of 1894 bayonets through the interwar period. This of course features the spring retained metal sleeve that we have here and was produced primarily in Norway, although some were imported from Germany. After World War II, the newly formed Heimevernet, or the Home Guard, continued to use Krag bayonets, but due to shortages, they produced a narrower frog variant. These were often more simplified and sometimes marked with post-war unit codes. Then we have the long straight frog. This is a longer and straighter frog, usually associated with the 1916 bayonet due to its thicker scabbard. It resembles the Home Guard design but is of earlier manufacture, possibly late pre-war or interwar period. And then you have also the Krigsskolen, or the Military Academy frog. This was used by cadets at the Norwegian Military Academy, or Krigsskolen, for ceremonial purposes. These frogs were made out of black leather and had red piping along the edge, so that it matched with the uniforms at the time. This sort of design actually continued later on to the 1942 Garand bayonet as well. And for markings, as we talked about earlier, mine has just a regimental name on the back. A lot of these frogs were marked with NI, which stands for Norsk Intendantur, which is the Norwegian Military Supply Detachment. Some imported frogs, especially the German-made ones, may include a manufacturer mark in either the leather or the hardware itself. Perhaps one of the rarest and most specialized bayonet accessories was the so-called Fjelds Knapp. This was introduced in around 1938. This was a small turned steel button developed by a bushmaker named Fjelds at the 6th Division School. It was specifically designed for winter use when cold temperatures and bulky gear made it easier to accidentally lose a bayonet during field exercises. The Fjelds Knapp was installed directly into the frog and fit into the bayonet's locking slot along the spine of the scabbard. Once in place, it physically locked the bayonet from sliding out, providing an extra level of retention. Over 4,000 of these buttons were ordered by the army, and many frogs were retrofitted with them before the war. The modification work was likely done locally at the unit level. There was also a proposal to add a simple leather strap that would loop over the grip, but that design was tested and rejected. Another lesser-seen accessory is the Portepee, a decorative knot usually associated with rank or ceremonial use. In Norway, a simple Portepee made of red wool with a short leather strap was primarily used by corporals in the King's Guard, or Garden. It was attached through a small hole on the bayonet grip, as you can see right here. And this is on all bayonets. Although this was never formally standardized beyond a brief mention in the bayonet's descriptive documentation. However, for a short period, other units outside the Guard also issued Portepees to corporals, but this never became widespread or permanent. Alright everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions regarding the bayonets themselves or anything else, feel free to comment them down below or email me. Also, if you feel like this video deserves it and you might have actually learned something about your own bayonet, feel free to leave it a like. Of course, that really helps the video spread it out to more people as well. And as usual, if you want to learn more about Nordic arms and history, consider subscribing. Until the next one, take care. Bye-bye.